This is Radio Moscow World Service. We now bring you the statement of the Soviet leadership. Because of the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's inability to carry on his duties, and in accordance with Article 1277 of the USSR Constitution, the USSR Vice President Gennady Yanayev takes over power. A state of emergency is introduced in separate parts of the USSR for 6 months as of 4 o'clock Moscow time on August 19, 1991.
Once the communist state constructed monuments to economic achievement, leaders like Khrushchev promising not only to match the West, but to outstrip it in economic performance and industrial production. 6 short years born in the death chamber of his predecessor, years that overwhelmed every known parameter of the tense East-West relationship in which the 20th century was forged. A rule that started with a kiss for Chernenko's widow and real contact with the people. Whilst the world fated him with its highest accolade, the Nobel Peace Prize, just 12 months ago, he was already a rapidly weakening force at home. Telling evidence of that came in January in the Baltic states. Here in Latvia's capital, 14 died as Gorbachev refused their bid to be free. Amid the mass demonstrations for Yeltsin outside the Kremlin walls, Gorbachev's balancing act between reformers and hardliners foundered. Still, he wanted to reform the communist system rather than risk all-out change. Gorbachev refused the miners' demands. Yeltsin mediated and proclaimed the mines now belonged to Russia. Still, Gorbachev flanked himself with hardliners despite their attempt in the summer to limit his powers. He ignored every warning of their true nature and intent. In their goodbyes to him in July lay all the portents for their humorless, unimaginative lunge for power a few weeks later. The frail attempts of ordinary Russians to resist the coup were hopelessly ineffective. There was little point dying beneath tank tracks in the face of such odds. It was not so much people power, but the abysmal organization of the coup that was eventually to defeat it. Inside the Russian parliament, the White House, on that first day of the coup, handling ammunition packs, the country's new breed of elected politicians prepared to defend themselves against an enemy whose tactics were already fatally flawed. The plotters had moved against the new Union Treaty designed to give parliaments like this one more power. But they failed to grasp that the power had anyway already shifted irreversibly away from the Kremlin. The coup leaders made practical blunders of naive proportions too, even failing to cut off most of the telephone lines and the radio transmissions from the Russian parliament that enabled the mayor of Moscow to make regular broadcasts.
Соответственно, объявляем незаконными все решения и распоряжения этого комитета. Призываем граждан России дать достойный ответ путчистам и требовать вернуть страну к нормальному конституционному развитию.
In stark contrast to Yeltsin's performance, the grey group of coup conspirators presented the outside world with an uncertain and bedraggled countenance. 2 were absent from this, their first public appearance on the first afternoon of the coup, one the worse for drink, the other from fading confidence in the endeavour. Within a week, Boris Pugo on the right would commit suicide. Their makeshift leader, Gennady Yanayev, on the left, had needed vodka to get him here at all. They had staged their putsch only after failing to force Gorbachev at his dacha in the Crimea to join them.
Михаил Сергеевич Горбачев находится сейчас на отдыхе и лечении в Крыму. Действительно, за эти годы он очень устал, и требуется какое-то время для того, чтобы он поправил свое здоровье. Я хочу сказать, что мы надеемся на то, что Михаил Сергеевич, поправившись, вернется к исполнению своих обязанностей.
Yanaev's trembling hands gave an all-too-graphic clue as to the condition in which they had launched the coup.
Может быть, я не помню, в ходе этих таких вот довольно острых разговоров давали кофе со спиртным. И вот после этого, через очень короткий срок, я, видимо, отключился. Причин, на ваш взгляд, заболевания Павлова?
Я думаю, что это излишнее употребление водки. А может быть, это он сделал для того, чтобы, как говорят, выйти из игры.
Ну а что, он постоянно так употребляет или стресс?
Вот буквально несколько раз с ним встретился.
However inebriated the plotters had been, they had succeeded in triggering the symbols of repression. Tanks around the Kremlin and other key installations in Moscow. By the late afternoon of the second day, tens of thousands of Yeltsin supporters were out defying the coup leaders.
Особенно здесь, в демократической Москве, агрессия эта, консервативная сила не пройдет. Пройдет демократия. Я призываю вас к этой демократии, а мы будем держаться здесь, в Доме Советов, столько, сколько надо, для того, чтобы добиться смещения этой хунты и действительно привлечения их к судебной ответственности.
Сыплю свет с эполет, юные командиры, приветы.
By the second nightfall of the coup, cracks were already beginning to appear in the military's support for the putsch. Troops from the Taman division, originally sent to encircle the White House and, if necessary, attack it, now dismounted from their vehicles to protect it. But close to the American embassy, there was sudden military panic. Some thought this was escalation for real. One person was shot here, two were run over by tanks. Incredibly, they were to prove the coup's only deaths. Though no one knew it then, within 48 hours of its start, the coup was already crumbling. At the Russian parliament, Yeltsin saw their departure as a decisive signal of victory. He relished recounting the mystery of their flight.
Вся группа этих юристов, членов так называемого комитета, всем составом выехала вовнутрь.
With the coup unraveled, the Russian parliament dispatched its own delegation to the Crimea to see Gorbachev as they boarded their plane at Moscow's Vnukovo airport. For perhaps the last time, Mikhail Gorbachev as president was all-powerful. Plotters and plotted against, vying for his blessing on their futures. Behind them in Moscow, Russian flags and flowers adorned the departing tanks. Ordinary people breathed free again. Carnations replaced shells as the army returned to barracks to watch the developing political chaos in the months to come. For the Gorbachev who came home that night was a very different president from the one who'd gone on holiday just 2 weeks before. As people demonstrated outside the Central Committee against the Communist Party, replacing its flag with that of the Russian Federation, Gorbachev could not grasp that 74 years of communist life had died. In the Russian parliament, Yeltsin was to force him to read the documents implicating the party.
Борис Николаевич мне сейчас, когда уже мы встретились, он дал краткое изложение заседания Кабинета министров, но я его еще не читал.
Gorbachev was to look on helplessly as Yeltsin signed the decree banning the Communist Party from operating on Russian soil.
Указ подписан. Запрещать Компартию, это, я вам прямо скажу, будет ошибкой со стороны такого демократичного и Верховного Совета, и президента России. Точно ли назван указ?
О незапрещении, о приостановлении деятельности Российской Компартии до выяснения судебными органами ее причастности ко всем этим событиям. Это совершенно законно.
What was the Soviet economy is now dollar-dependent. Western prosperity is available, but only for hard currency. In contrast to the empty shelves and queues at the state shops, this Moscow supermarket has an endless supply of luxury goods. All the food is flown in. But the prices are all in dollars, the alternative currency well beyond the reach of most ordinary Russians. It is into this market that the new Russian mafia is moving, exploiting the currency black market and the collapse of fiscal controls, creating a tiny criminal elite bitterly resented by the ruble-dependent majority. When 3 weeks ago Russia signed the Minsk Agreement with Ukraine and Belarus, Yeltsin effectively took over power from Gorbachev. The August coup to save the Union had ended dividing it into a commonwealth, with the problems that overwhelmed Gorbachev still unresolved. In the Ukraine and here in its capital, Kiev, 9 out of 10 people voted for independence. Their leader, Leonid Kravchuk, once a die-hard communist, was swept back to office by skillfully hijacking the nationalist cause for his own. Here too, the people's frustration is high. Independence has not filled high street shelves. It's not just the threat of hunger, but the collapse of heating installations in a bitter winter, the inability to repair and rebuild. Once again, food shortages stalk the streets. Queues extend from every provision shop. 4 days from now, Mr. Yeltsin plans to allow food prices to float free in the market.